Hello everybody, welcome back to another exciting edition of Edpuzzle Lecture Notes. Today we're going to go over the parts of different neurons. This is the one you almost always see. This is a multipolar neuron, and it says this is a motor neuron. And what you need to know, the receiving part are these branches on this side. These are called the dendrites. And the neuron is what sends your nerve impulses throughout your body. So when you're just sitting there thinking, or if you want your arm to move or your hand to move to write something, your muscles are able to move because they're getting information from neurons. So neurons are sending those electrochemical signals through your nervous system, the brain, spinal cords, and then the peripheral nerves outside of your brain and spinal cord. But know this, the impulse, nerve impulse, otherwise called the action potential, only travels in one direction. It travels from the dendrites through the cell body, which is right here, and then along the axon until it reaches the axon terminals and eventually the synaptic end bulbs, where then it's either going to stimulate a muscle or gland, or it can release little messengers, little neurotransmitters into the synapse, which could maybe, these are the dendrites of another neuron, not the greatest dendrites, but those neurotransmitters might trigger that second neuron, that postsynaptic neuron, to continue the message along. So we're going to go over all the parts, definitely the dendrites, the cell body, for sure the axon, the nodes of Ranvier, I don't see where it says, but the myelin sheath, and obviously the synaptic end bulbs and the synaptic or the axon terminals. Alright, so neurons, the little brief story of the neuron. It is definitely the functional unit of the nervous system. So if you had to think of one cell in the nervous system, you're going to think of neurons. Now, yeah, you might say glial cells are just as important, and maybe they are. But that's going to be the first type of cell you think of, are the neurons. They last a long time, so they're not like your skin, which only lasts a few weeks, or blood cells, which can last a few months. These guys last your whole lifetime, unless you do something bad to them, which causes them to die, like maybe concussion or consuming too much drugs or alcohol that can destroy and kill your neurons. That's why it's always good to live a healthy lifestyle. Neurons are what's called amitotic. That means they do not go through mitosis. For those of you guys that remember way back in regular bio, mitosis, that's how your cells reproduce. That's how one cell will turn into two cells. Well, neurons don't do this. So you have all the neurons you're ever going to have right now. So you cannot make new neurons. That's what amitotic means. What else do you need to know? They have a high metabolic rate. That's why most of the, not most, but a large percentage of the food you take in and the oxygen you breathe goes straight to the brain, because all those billions and billions of neurons in your brain, they need a constant supply of both oxygen and glucose, because they will run out of both under 30 seconds. So you need to continuously give those neurons all the oxygen and glucose they can take, because they require a lot of it. And most importantly, basically their job, they produce action potentials. And that's the nerve impulse, their electrical excitability. They're able to send electrochemical signals very rapidly throughout the body. And now the little parts of a neuron. First one we're going to go over is the cell body. Also know that it's also called the soma. You will see it called that probably just as much as you call the cell body. So it's also called the soma. It's what contains the nucleus of the cell. And it also has a prominent nucleolus. That's a structure inside the nucleus, which makes ribosomes. It's got Nissl bodies, which are important in making proteins, neurofilaments, which are also important in giving the cell its shape and support. Same thing with microtubules, which move materials inside the cell. But what you really need to know, it contains the nucleus. So it kind of controls all the activities that the neuron does. It's also at the end of the cell body and the start of the axon, a place called the axon hillock. That's where the gathering of the stimuli, either usually from other neurons, and that's where the neuron kind of decides if it's going to fire a nerve impulse and action potential, or is it not, because neurons work on the all or none principle. Either they fire a full strength signal or they do not fire at all. So they don't fire weak nerve impulses. The next real important structures are called the dendrites. These are what senses stimuli. And they're located right here. And they're kind of like little antennas which branch off, in this case from the cell body, and they're noticing. So if there's neurotransmitters in the synapse between it and another neuron, it's the dendrites which first notice that. It's also the dendrites which can notice things in the external environment, so heat and pressure. So it's the dendrites which first sense or notice a stimulus. And there's always a lot of these dendrites because these guys, they're communicating with hundreds or thousands of neurons. So these dendrites are just all over the place, and they're receiving information, usually from another neuron, through little chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. And if the neuron is stimulated enough by these neurotransmitters, it will fire an action potential or a nerve impulse. So those are the dendrites. Those are the receiving part of the neuron. They're the ones that receive the stimulus. And it'll conduct that impulse towards the cell body or the soma. And next very important structure is the axon or axons. That is the long cylindrical or cylinder or process which extends from the cell body, or more precisely from the axon hillock on the cell body, and goes all the way down to the axon terminals and eventually the little tiny synaptic end bulb. So this is kind of like the telephone wire which the nerve impulse travels along. So if this cell, if it's stimulated enough by its environment, if it sends a nerve impulse, it's going to travel down the axon, the whole length of the neuron. Now these axons, you could have axon collaterals, which right here, so this is like an axon that is branching off from this main axon, and a lot of times these actually go back and stimulate itself, the same neuron, which is a way that it can regulate its own activity and kind of suppress it in almost like a negative feedback. So if it's getting too active, that axon collateral can actually say, hey, neuron, settle down. Enough of the impulses already. So the function of the axon, it conducts the impulses, the action potentials, away from the cell body, down the axon, and it's either going to stimulate another neuron or an effector, like a gland or a muscle. So whenever you move a muscle, it's a neuron which is connected to, or it's innervated with, a muscle, which is the effector, which produces some sort of desired response. And the next structure, axon terminals. So if the dendrites get stimulated enough, and at the axon hillock, the neuron is stimulated enough to threshold, and that nerve impulse or action potential travels down the axon, eventually it's going to reach the axon terminals. Well, there's a space. So if this were the dendrites for the next neuron, there is a space in between the dendrites of one neuron, the postsynaptic neuron, and the axon terminals of the presynaptic neurons. Well, that nerve impulse can't jump over that space. So what the neuron has to do, it has to release chemical messengers into that space. And those are neurotransmitters. So it's here where the axon terminals, which contain these little bubbles called synaptic vesicles, which are loaded with neurotransmitters. If the nerve is going to send an action potential through the synapse, these synaptic vesicles release the neurotransmitters into the space, and it's these chemical messengers, these neurotransmitters, which could then stimulate the next neuron, or the postsynaptic neuron, to continue the message on down the line. And same thing if it was not another neuron that's coming up next, if it's an effector, like say a muscle, well then this neuron, this motor neuron, would release a special neurotransmitter called acetylcholine, which will cause your muscles to contract. So basically the axon terminals are what carry on, they pass on the message or the nerve impulse to the next neuron or to an effector. And they do this via little transmitters called neurotransmitters. This one's going to be very quick because there's not a whole lot of difference. So you had the axon terminal on the last one. The very ends of the axon terminals, those are the synaptic end bulbs, which contain the little bubbles, little vacuoles or vesicles, which contain the neurotransmitters. And to stimulate the next neuron or an effector, those little chemical messengers, the neurotransmitters, are released into the synapse to stimulate the next neuron or to cause an effector to produce some sort of response. A little close-up view of the synaptic end bulb on the presynaptic neuron. So this would be the presynaptic, synaptic. Pre means before, so this is the neuron that is before the synapse, which is right here. Remember, the synapse is the space between this neuron, the presynaptic neuron, and the postsynaptic, I didn't know it was written there, postsynaptic neuron. So this guy you see in an action potential has reached the synaptic end bulb. So these are the synaptic vesicles, and these guys are going to fuse with this membrane in the end bulb, and then it's going to release these neurotransmitters into the space or into the synapse. Now the postsynaptic neuron, it's called ligand gated because it is stimulated by certain neurotransmitters, which are basically molecules that have a specific shape. They fit into these little protein channels, and when they do, they allow ions to come in. And when that happens, if enough of those ions come into the postsynaptic neuron, and we're going to go over this, it causes enough depolarization, which causes that postsynaptic neuron to fire its own action potential and carry on the signal that the first neuron passed on to it. Now the myelin and the Schwann cells. Let's start with the myelin. Where's it at? All right. Myelin. So on this thing, it's going to be right here. So the axon a lot of times looks like a string of, I don't know, hot dogs or sausages. Well, each one of those little sausages, that makes up the myelin sheath. It's made of mostly fat. So that axon right there is myelinated. And it gets myelinated by Schwann cells. So each one of these little ovals, that's a Schwann cell that has wrapped around the axon to insulate it with its mostly fat. Now their main function, which you need to know, is that axons which are myelinated, which have these Schwann cells, in this case a Schwann cell because it's in the peripheral nervous system. I guess before I forget, yes, Schwann cells, they produce the myelin sheath around neurons, but only in the peripheral nervous system. So these are not active in the central nervous system. It's going to be a different type of cell which wraps the myelin around the axons in neurons of the central nervous system. But the main thing you need to know is these guys speed up nerve impulses dramatically. And the way they do that is because neurons, if their axon is myelinated, the nerve impulse does not have to travel the whole length of the neuron. Instead, that nerve impulse can jump from gap to gap to gap to gap to gap to gap, which makes it so much faster. And remember, each of these little gaps in between the myelin, those are called nodes of Ranvier. Nodes of Ranvier. Those are just the gaps in between the little sausages. And these allow the impulse to jump down the axon much, much faster. And remember, Schwann cells only wrap the axons of neurons in the peripheral nervous system. I guarantee you will need to know that. The next part of a neuron is called the axon hillock. It's kind of like a combination. It's like where the cell body ends and the axon begins. But what you need to know, this is where depolarization of the neuron begins if threshold is reached. Now, what does that mean? It is right here. This is where the nerve impulse or action potential begins. It is this area of the neuron that has to be stimulated enough, and it gets stimulated by all the information it receives from the dendrites. If the axon hillock gets stimulated enough, boom, that neuron will send a nerve impulse or action potential down the axon to the axon terminals, which will then release the neurotransmitters. So that is where the nerve impulse starts, at the axon hillock. I didn't know this slide was coming. We already went over axon collaterals. Remember, those are axons that can just branch off from the main axon. And they can stimulate another neuron, or they can kind of back around and stimulate itself. So that's the axon collaterals. Axons which break off from the main axon right there. And a little nice diagram of the neuron. Remember, here is the soma, or the cell body. Contains a lot of mitochondria. Remember, mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. Neurons need tons and tons of energy because they are always active. Whether they are being used, whether they're firing an action potential or not, they constantly need to change the conditions which are inside the axon and inside the cell body. So they're constantly pumping things, pumping ions out, and they're also pumping ions in. So these guys require tons and tons of energy. Here, of course, is the nucleus, and we've gone over everything else. Putting neurons into structural classification, so basically classifying on what they look like. The most common type, and this is the one you always see diagrams of, that's the multipolar. It is the most common type of neuron in your body. These are both motor and interneurons. Remember, the interneurons are the ones that are located inside your central nervous system. Another type, which is the rarest, are the bipolar neurons. In the next slide, I'm going to show you how to tell the difference between them. And these are found in your special senses, like retina for vision, inner ear and olfactory. Those are for hearing and for smelling. Unipolar neurons, know this. These guys are always sensory neurons. That's probably why it's in bold. And I'm going to show you how to recognize these depending on the processes which emanate or come out of the cell body. All right, so what do these different classes of neurons look like? Remember, all you got to do is first you got to find the cell body. And here's the cell body on this neuron. Here's the cell body on that one, and here's the cell body on that one. Now all you got to do is count the processes or structures which come out of the cell body. So if you look here, I see many processes, many appendages coming off of that neuron. That's why it's called a multipolar neuron. So remember, this is the most common interneuron and motor neurons. That's a multipolar. Now if you look at this guy, here's the cell body. How many structures do you see coming out of it? I see one, I see two. That's it. There's only two. That's why this is a bipolar neuron. Remember, this was for the special senses and not a very common type of neuron. Now, if you look at this cell body right here, there's only one process which is coming out of that cell body. There's only one. And then, yeah, sure, it branches off going up and down. But since there's only one, that is a unipolar neuron. Remember, these guys are always sensory neurons. All right, almost done. Now we're going to class them into functional classification. So not basically what they look like, but what do they do? And the first one is a sensory, otherwise called an afferent neuron. These are the ones that are sensing stimuli from maybe the skin or your muscles or joints or your internal organs and viscera. And they're going to take that, they're going to send that information to the brain and spinal cord. And remember, the brain and spinal cord is what makes up your central nervous system, or CNS. So these guys are always constantly monitoring your environment, both internal and external. And when they find changes, something that maybe takes you out of homeostasis, they're the ones that, hey, the brain and the spinal cord need to know about this information. They're the one that sense it, therefore they're called sensory. They sense the changes and they send that signal to your brain and spinal cord. Remember, most of them are unipolar, except for the special senses like vision and smell and hearing. I don't know if you're going to know this in this unit. The cell bodies, remember cell bodies which are located outside of the brain and spinal cord or outside the CNS, those are called ganglia. Well, all these sensory neurons, they enter the spinal cord in what's called the dorsal root ganglia. Now hopefully you remember, dorsal means towards the back. So these guys are, the sensory neurons are entering your spinal cord towards the back or the dorsal part of the spinal cord. So not in the ventral towards the stomach. They enter towards the dorsal part of the spinal cord. And just outside of it, that's where the ganglia, it's just a big bundle of cell bodies which form that. I know eventually you're going to need to know that, but I don't know if you'll need to know it in this unit or not. Now the opposite of the sensory or afferent neurons are the motor or efferent neurons. So once your sensory neurons detect some sort of change and that information is transmitted to your brain and spinal cord, well, the CNS may want to make some sort of response. So these motor nerve impulses go this time from the central nervous system, and then it's going to innervate or connect with a muscle or a gland to produce some sort of desired response. Now, the way I remember this is motor neurons exit. They leave the central nervous system. Well, exit and efferent both start with an E. And that's how I remember it. And now the last type of functional class of neurons are the interneurons. So these are kind of like the in-between neurons. So sensory neurons give sensory information to the interneurons. We'll put that in blue. And that's what's in your central nervous system. It is these interneurons which decide on what to do, and they will transmit that information back to a muscle or gland, and that would be the motor neurons. So the green, sensory, detects some sort of change in your internal or external environment, sends that information to the interneurons, and then that information is relayed back through a motor neuron to an effector like a muscle or gland. All right, thank you very much for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.